Have you ever wondered if what we see on the outside is really the truth? Have you ever thought that a fleeting moment could change everything? Today, we are going to tell you a story that you won't believe, where misunderstandings and prejudice collide in what seems like a routine arrest. And just when you think everything will end easily, suddenly everything changes in an unexpected way. This story is not just about one person, it's about all of us. So sit tight, don't miss a second. Before we begin, we'd like to know, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it now? This story will make you think deeply. Share your thoughts with us now. This story begins on an ordinary day in New York, where Marcus Hayes, a 45-year-old man dressed in a sleek black suit, has just stepped out of his Tesla Model S. This scene seems nothing special, but in the eyes of two nearby patrolling police officers, Marcus is just another black man walking by. Like many others, Marcus, a federal prosecutor, faces complex cases every day with sharp arguments in the courtroom. But today he's not heading into court as usual. Today he is confronted with an unimaginable situation. As he confidently walks toward the courthouse, two police officers, Jason Park and Mark O'Connor, see a black man in an expensive suit driving a luxury car, an image all too familiar in cases they've encountered before. They don't see Marcus for who he is. They see only a suspect. A black man standing out too much, and in that moment, everything changes. Jason Park, a police officer with deeply rooted prejudices, doesn't think twice. Marcus is just a suspect, and there's no need for further explanation. Whether Marcus is a federal prosecutor or the head of a prestigious profession doesn't matter to Jason Park. The issue is that he sees a black man, and that's enough to make a decision. Marcus had just gone through a normal day, but now he's facing an unexpected challenge. A confrontation with the police, a battle not just to defend himself, but to stand against a justice system being tested.
Charm. 의심.
This morning in New York, the sky looks just like any other day. The gentle golden sun shines down on the busy streets, illuminating the glass facades of tall buildings. The city, full of hustle and bustle, as always, beckons to the people living in it, regardless of their profession or purpose. But for Marcus Hayes, today feels different. As a federal prosecutor dedicated to justice and integrity, he never expected that he himself would face the biggest challenge of his life. Marcus steps out of his glossy black Tesla Model S, holding a leather briefcase firmly in his hand. His dark gray suit with its meticulous cuts highlights his confident demeanor. His face is calm, though there's a slight unease inside him as he prepares for an important trial. For him, today is like any other workday, but something in the air feels off. He can't quite put his finger on it, but a strange sense of unease is creeping into his mind. As he walks past the courthouse, a police car parked on the side of the road catches his attention. Officers Jason Park and Mark O'Connor, both experienced officers, sit in the car, both with firmly held views on what they consider suspects, whether they have evidence or not. Patrolling is part of their job, but today something feels off. When Jason Park sees a Marcus, he doesn't see a federal prosecutor walking to court for work. Instead, he sees a black man in an expensive suit walking alone, seemingly out of place in this neighborhood. Suspect. A thought flashes through his mind. He tries to dismiss it, but the feeling grows stronger. The first impression sometimes is all they need. That's enough, Jason thinks to himself. Not needing any further justification, he's already made up his mind. See that? Mark O'Connor, sitting next to him, glances over and sighs. Another black man walking in this area. Huh. Yep, Jason replies, gripping the steering wheel with no doubt. Both agree that this man couldn't possibly be an ordinary citizen, and they both know that someone like him, walking alone and not in a hurry, must be doing something illegal. I'll check him out, Jason says decisively, stepping out of the car without hesitation. Mark doesn't object. He just shrugs and continues watching. In their minds, this is an easy decision. No more questions, no need for further investigation. Marcus in his fine suit is simply another suspect. A black man with an expensive car walking too confidently. They never think to question or learn more about him. As Marcus prepares to walk into the courthouse, he feels a slight breeze tousle his hair, and then suddenly hears a voice from behind. Sir, stop. Jason Park stands there, his voice sharp, looking at Marcus with an unfriendly expression. He walks briskly toward Marcus, not hesitating. For a second, Marcus turned around, surprised, his eyes narrowing slightly, confused but still maintaining his composure. What's going on, officer? Stop. Hands up. Jason didn't hesitate. He immediately ordered Marcus to comply without offering any explanation. Marcus didn't panic. He stood straight, looking Jason directly in the eyes with the calmness of someone who had stood in court thousands of times. I'm a federal prosecutor. I'm on my way to court. But instead of receiving the respect he expected, Jason looked at Marcus with suspicion. Doesn't matter, you won't mind answering a few questions, as Marcus began to react strongly, saying he hadn't done anything wrong. The two officers continued to approach. Jason began unlocking the handcuffs without hesitation, his demeanor firm. We suspect you're a suspect. Please submit to a search. The confrontation between Marcus and the police began to intensify, and a crowd started to gather around them, recording videos. Both Marcus and the officers knew that this had escalated far beyond a simple check. Marcus could feel all eyes on him, and he knew that his life had changed forever. Not because of his wrongdoing, but because of the prejudice and racial judgment he was now facing right in front of the courthouse where he had worked his entire career. In the thick tension of the moment, no one knew that this confrontation wouldn't just be a small incident, but the beginning of something much larger. The city of New York was bustling as usual, but today there was something different, something heavy in the air. For Marcus Hayes, a federal prosecutor today, was supposed to be another day stepping into court to fight for justice, a job he had done thousands of times before. However, today would become a day he could never have imagined, a day that destiny had turned everything upside down. Marcus walked confidently along the sidewalk, holding his leather briefcase tightly with important files for the trial he was about to participate in. His dark gray suit paired with a pricey watch on his wrist made him look sharp, but also drew attention. He wasn't just an ordinary man in this city. Every step he took seemed to carry a responsibility, a dignified presence that only those in law could understand. But in this moment, no one in this city truly understood who he was. Jason Park, a young police officer, sat in the patrol car with his older colleague, Mark O'Connor, both surveying the area. However, Jason's eyes never left Marcus as he stepped out of the Tesla Model S. There was a clear difference between him and the other pedestrians around. Not because of the luxury car, but because of his confident demeanor, the way he walked, steady and unflustered. A man with an expensive appearance, and that was something Jason couldn't ignore. Look at that, Mark, Jason said, raising an eyebrow as he spotted Marcus. He seems strange. A black man dressed like that walking in this area. Mark, sitting next to him, merely shrugged, seemingly indifferent, but deep down he felt a slight suspicion. People like that, always walking alone, never a coincidence, he murmured. Despite Mark's hesitation, Jason had already made up his mind. I'm going to check him out, he said, and without waiting for Mark to respond, he stepped out of the car with a determined look. Neither officer thought that the man they were about to approach was a federal prosecutor, one of the leading figures in the legal system they interacted with every day. Instead, Jason saw a potential suspect, someone who in his eyes could only be a criminal. So without hesitation, he decided to confront Marcus and make an arrest without any clear justification. Marcus was heading to the courthouse feeling the calm and confidence that the courthouse always provided him. However, a sudden voice from behind caused him to stop. Sir, stop immediately. Jason Park shouted from behind his voice. Cold Marcus turned us around, and in that instant, his eyes met Jason's. There was tension in the air that Marcus couldn't explain, but he stood firm, not showing fear. What's going on, officer? He asked, his voice still calm, but his eyes now filled with suspicion. Jason moved closer, his hands already ready to handcuff Marcus. You match the description of a suspect, he said without a shred of empathy. Step out of the vehicle and put your hands up. Marcus began to feel a clear sense of injustice, he repeated firmly. I'm a federal prosecutor. I'm on my way to court. But instead of respect or understanding from the officer, Jason kept his firm attitude and continued to issue commands. If you're a prosecutor, it shouldn't be hard for you to cooperate, right? He said, then immediately reached out and ordered Marcus to put his hands behind his back. Mark O'Connor stood by, seemingly hesitant, but he didn't dare intervene. What happened in that moment, he wasn't sure what conditions led to his silence, but those thoughts weren't enough to stop Jason. Both officers couldn't understand that they were making a huge mistake by treating Marcus like a criminal. Marcus looked at Jason, a flash of anger flickering in his eyes, but he still tried to remain calm. What are you doing? Do you understand you're wrong? But there was no change in Jason's attitude. Even though Marcus tried to explain who he was in Jason's eyes, he was just another black man with an eye-catching appearance, walking down the street, Another arrest wouldn't hurt anything. And so his hands were cuffed and his leather briefcase fell to the ground, unexpectedly, opening with a small string from Alicia's lucky charm, falling out symbolizing the injustice that awaited. This confrontation was not just a legal mistake, but also a symbol of the racial discrimination still deeply ingrained in society. But in the silence of this moment, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. At that moment, the handcuffs had tightened around Marcus Hayes' wrists, but it wasn't physical pain that gripped him. It was a growing sense of helplessness. The sounds of New York City echoed around him, but they seemed distant, as if he were in a completely different world, a place where injustice had become the norm, and he, a federal prosecutor, had become its victim. Marcus sat quietly in the back of the police car, his eyes fixed on the window as if trying to find solace in the world outside. But all he saw was the encroaching darkness. He could feel the eyes of Jason Park and Mark O'Connor watching him from the front. The two officers said nothing, but their silence only deepened the heavy, tense atmosphere in the car. He could sense the growing tension inside the cramped space. The air in the car was stifling, and Marcus began to realize that this was not just a simple misunderstanding. This was an event in which society, the very system he had always trusted, was pushing him into a battle for which he had not prepared. He knew his life would never be the same after this moment. Jason Park glanced into the rearview mirror, his eyes locked in a steely gaze, as if trying to confirm that everything was going according to plan. Unusually quiet, Jason remarked, then sneered, attempting to break the tense atmosphere in the car. Marcus didn't respond. He remained silent, bitterly asking himself a question. What do I have to do to prove that I'm not being arrested for these unjust reasons? He had spent his entire life fighting for justice, yet now he was the one being subjected to the very prejudices he had tried to erase. The overwhelming sense of helplessness weighed heavily on him. Marcus knew that if he resisted or made a wrong move, things would only escalate. The system he had served, this very system, would never stand by him. And that made him feel as though his identity, his dignity as a person was being violated. Mark O'Connor, the older officer sitting next to Jason, seemed to sense the growing tension as well. However, his silence could not hide the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't a bad person, but the system he served with orders from above and societal pressures had created an environment where actions like this seemed normal. Marcus glanced over at Mark, trying to gauge the thoughts of this man, but all he received in return was a vacant look, as though Mark himself didn't want to admit that he was participating in something wrong. But still he remained silent, siding with Jason because simply that was the process they had been taught. That was the rut they had fallen into. A part of Marcus began to sneer inwardly. He had lived in a society where even someone with a stable career like him could not escape the growing racial discrimination and prejudice. More than ever, he felt that what he was facing wasn't just the mistake of a single officer. It was part of a corrupt system that he had spent his entire life working within. As the police car slowly drove through the streets of the city, Marcus couldn't shake the dark thoughts flooding his mind. He recalled the struggles he had endured throughout his career, the battles he had fought to bring justice to so many people. But now he was the one who had to run from the very system he had protected. He couldn't understand why someone like him, who should have been respected by society, was being treated like a criminal just because of his skin color. There must be a reason, Marcus told himself. They won't be able to keep me forever. The truth will come out, it's just a matter of time. But in his heart, a feeling of unease and despair began to creep in as he realized that the truth might not save him in a society so riddled with injustice. The car stopped in front of the courthouse, and Marcus was led out walking with his hands cuffed, his demeanor unyielding. He realized that no matter how strong he was, the invisible walls of prejudice and injustice would not easily crumble. He walked into the courthouse not as a federal prosecutor, but as a man who had been destroyed by the system. With every step he took into the courthouse, a strange feeling arose deep within him, like he had been swallowed by the very shadow of discrimination that he had spent his entire life fighting to erase. Everything now felt like a battle, not just for legal justice, but for his own dignity and humanity. The feeling of being coerced and judged solely based on his skin color made Marcus reflect on the walls he had faced throughout his life, walls in a society where prejudice could erase all the successes and efforts he had achieved. But Marcus would not give up. He knew this fight was far from over. Every step he took today was the step of a person fighting for justice, a warrior who would never surrender. As the police car carrying Marcus Hayes drove away from the courthouse area, A video of the arrest began to spread across social media. The first images, blurry yet detailed, were quickly shared, and within hours they had become a sensation. The entire city of New York, and then the whole of the United States, began to pay attention to Marcus's case. A black man in an expensive suit arrested right in front of the courthouse just for matching the description, a vague and unfounded description. Hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus, #End Racial Profiling, and #Stop Abuse of Power began flooding social media platforms. The video capturing the moment Marcus was handcuffed and shoved into the police car not only sparked outrage, but also awakened a generation weary of the injustices in society. Thousands of people from across the country and beyond began voicing their anger. They weren't just supporting Marcus. It was a powerful call for justice and reform in law enforcement, where racial discrimination still persists. Marcus's story wasn't just a confrontation between an individual and a police officer. It was a clash with a systemic issue where power had been abused to a level of opacity and discrimination. Things intensified when Marcus decided not to stay silent. He realized that if he stood still and hoped justice would prevail, it would remain a distant ideal. Marcus was a man of law, and this time he would use justice to fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had endured the same unfair treatment. At the same time, civil rights organizations began reaching out to him. Anti-racial discrimination activists and police reform groups grew closer to Marcus' letters of support. Words of encouragement and constant phone calls kept pushing him forward. Even some members of the media spoke out in his favor, saying that this incident would become a turning point in the fight against the abuse of power and racial discrimination. From small protests in New York to larger marches in other cities, people began to understand the pain that they had previously overlooked. They no longer stood on the sidelines observing Marcus's story. They became participants, a part of the story themselves. Discussions about human rights, equality, and justice expanded, no longer confined to courtrooms or political meetings, but spreading across streets, cafes, and social media forums. However, the support for Marcus wasn't always smooth sailing. Jason Park, the officer who had ordered his arrest, quickly became a name publicly criticized. The video footage of the interaction between Marcus and Park was analyzed in detail, from every gesture and glance to the words filled with suspicion and misconceptions. Yet rather than reconsidering his actions, Park clung to what he believed was the right reason: just doing my job. But those standing with Marcus would not accept such excuses. They began to harshly criticize how the police handled situations, especially when it came to people of color. The so-called procedures that officers followed became outdated and unreasonable in the eyes of the public. The separation between rights power and racial discrimination could no longer be concealed in the shadows. Right in the heart of the city, waves of protests erupted. Crowds of people stretched across New York streets, holding up large banners with slogans such as "We won't stay silent anymore." Police are instruments of justice, not tools of discrimination, and justice is a right for all. The movement against the abuse of power was not only supported by those who had been discriminated against, but had also spread to anyone who longed for a more equal and just society. Marcus could not have imagined that this event would create such a powerful wave. He was not just the victim of an unjust arrest. He had become a symbol for those who had suffered in silence from discrimination. And in that moment, Marcus Hayes realized that his fight had only just begun. He might face hardships and forces trying to protect the old system, but one thing was clear: he could not stand idly by while this injustice continued. Marcus's story had transcended the personal, becoming an all-encompassing struggle for a just government where everyone, regardless of race or status, deserve respect and equal rights. Thus, the wave of the Justice for Marcus movement didn't end with calls or small protests. It began to change the system like an unquenchable flame burning brightly in the hearts of every citizen, a reminder that justice is not something distant, but a battle that requires perseverance and the participation of all of the iris. With no clear reason, Marcus Hayes had become a symbol of the injustice that people of color face in modern society. The outrage and support from the community helped him no longer just be a lone victim, but a voice for all those who had silently endured racial discrimination. Not stopping there, Marcus was determined to take the next step, demanding an official investigation into the actions of Officer Jason Park and his colleague Mark O'Connor. With the help of civil rights organizations, social activists, and civil rights supporters, Marcus began collecting crucial evidence to shed light on the issues within the police force. He knew this event was not just a personal mistake, but part of a long-standing corrupt system, one that had always targeted people of color with vague and unfounded reasons. These officers had abused their power, arresting innocent people based on subjective judgments with no actual evidence. During the investigation, evidence of racial discrimination in a series of arrests began to be exposed. Internal documents from the New York Police Department and reports on unjustified traffic stops were collected. Police officers' notes revealed a recurring habit of stopping black drivers based on vague reasons, such as looking suspicious, driving in a high-crime area, or driving an expensive car. These incidents didn't just happen once, but formed a pattern, a mindset deeply ingrained within a significant portion of the police force. The case involving Officer Jason Park, who arrested Marcus, was not an isolated incident. He was a product of a system that had long been accustomed to creating baseless profiles to arrest, search, and pursue individuals they deemed dangerous simply because of their race. This evidence quickly leaked out, shaking the authorities and igniting a powerful wave of public backlash. Videos of previous arrests were made public, further fueling public anger. Protests erupted across major cities in the United States. In New York, thousands of people flooded the streets, carrying banners calling for police reform and demanding an end to racial profiling and arrests. Civil rights organizations and activists began calling for comprehensive reforms in policing, from retraining officers to changing the way the system operates. With the help of his lawyers and legal experts, Marcus demanded a thorough investigation into the actions of the police officers involved in his arrest, as well as similar incidents that had occurred before. He called for an independent commission to review all arrests made without solid reasoning. Conversations, meetings, and demands for reform were presented, with the goal not only to address his case, but to change the entire system. The police force was under immense pressure. Allegations of racial discrimination in numerous arrests had become an issue that could no longer be ignored. Marcus Hayes was no longer just an individual harmed by discrimination. He had become a leader, a pioneer in the fight for justice, and someone who was relentlessly pushing back against injustice. The media kept covering the case. Everyday news programs and reports broadcasted Marcus's wrongful arrest and the shocking revelations about similar incidents within the police force. Legal experts, civil rights activists, and even ordinary citizens began to speak out, demanding an independent investigation and calling for a fair and unbiased justice system. Support for Marcus grew stronger. The protests didn't only take place in New York, but spread across other major cities in the U.S., such as Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. People from various walks of life began to rise up not just to protect Marcus, but to defend their own rights and honor in front of a system that could abuse its power at any moment. Marcus Hayes knew that his battle wasn't going to be easy, and he would face many difficulties and challenges from those protecting the old system. But he also realized that he was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for all those who had endured racial discrimination, for those who had no voice, for those oppressed by an unjust system. Meanwhile, Jason Park and Mark O'Connor began to feel the tension. Both officers knew they were walking a dangerous path, but instead of reflecting on their actions, they looked for ways to protect the system they had been trained to serve. However, public opposition and pressure from civil rights organizations continued to grow. Marcus Hayes was no longer just a victim. He was leading a movement, a fight that would eventually change the way people viewed law enforcement, justice, and the rights of every citizen in society. Marcus's next steps would be an even greater challenge as he began to face more powerful adversaries, those who would not easily relinquish the power they had held for so long. But Marcus was ready because he knew that his fight wasn't just for himself, but for a just society without discrimination. The battle that Marcus Hayes and his family were fighting was not a normal struggle. This was a battle against a system that had become deeply ingrained in every corner of society. Though Marcus had gained support from the community and civil rights organizations, the opposition from the conservative forces within the police force remained strong. These people refused to acknowledge the truth, and they would do everything in their power to maintain their control. They saw Marcus's investigation and the reforms he called for as a direct threat to the entire system. They had built Marcus Hayes never imagined that fighting for justice would lead to such a prolonged battle. He had witnessed the police system protecting corrupt officers, covering up and excusing wrongdoings. However, the more he faced resistance from the police, the more he realized that this fight couldn't stop. If he stopped, not only would he continue to suffer, but thousands of others would also keep enduring racial discrimination and abuse of power without anyone standing up for them. It wasn't just the opposition from the police that Marcus had to face, but also the pressure from conservative forces in politics and society. Politicians, many of whom had long-standing relationships with police leaders, began to work to prevent any change that could threaten their position. They tried to deflect blame for the incidents, deliberately obscuring the nature of the issue, and even went so far as to launch smear campaigns against Marcus and his family. Meanwhile, Marcus and Angela, with the support from the community, began proposing significant reforms. One of the first and most important proposals was to establish independent oversight bodies to review the actions of the police force, aiming to reduce power abuse. Marcus knew that this would challenge those in power within the police, but he believed it was a necessary step to clean up the system and create a true environment of justice. Angela, Marcus's wife, had always been by his side throughout this journey. Although she knew the fight would be long and difficult, she also understood that there was no other choice. When Marcus grew weary and sometimes considered giving up, Angela was the one who reminded him of the ideals and goals they had chosen. She always reminded Marcus that they weren't just fighting for themselves, but for a future generation that wouldn't have to live in the shadow of racism and oppression. In the following weeks, with the support of civil rights groups, Marcus began demanding the public release of police complaint reports. He wanted people to understand that incidents like his arrest were not isolated cases. They were part of a much larger issue, one that could no longer be hidden in the shadows. These complaint reports needed to be made public so that people could better understand the extent of racial discrimination in the police force and how this power had been abused to oppress innocent people. The community, from ordinary citizens to human rights organizations, began speaking out more strongly. They organized large protests not only in New York, but also in other major cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. These protests were not only to condemn the wrongful actions of the police officers, but also to call for change within the police system. People were standing up for justice and for those who had never had the opportunity to speak up. Meanwhile, Jason Park and Mark O'Connor, the officers involved in Marcus's arrest, seemed to feel threatened by this wave of change. Park, who had ordered Marcus's arrest, began to realize that his actions were now being scrutinized by the public eye in the legal system. However, instead of taking responsibility and changing his stance, he maintained a rigid position, believing that he was simply following orders and adhering to police procedure. Mark O'Connor, who had witnessed the incident without intervening, also couldn't avoid questions from colleagues within the force and criticism from the public. While he was not the one to initiate the arrest, his silence throughout the ordeal made him face an overwhelming sense of guilt. This realization forced him to confront himself and reconsider his role in the police system. Marcus's fight was no longer just about seeking justice for himself. It was about a fairer future for everyone. He began to see that the more he fought, the more significant the challenges became. However, he also realized that the more people stood by him, the more voices that joined in this battle would no longer be a personal struggle, but a movement for real societal change. However, the resistance from conservative forces within the police and government showed no signs of waning. These forces continued to find ways to prevent any change. But Marcus Hayes had learned an important lesson. This battle would not be won in a day. It was a long, ongoing fight, and he would not stop until true justice was served not only for himself, but for all those who had suffered under this system. After many weeks of struggle, Marcus Hayes began to feel the sweet fruits of perseverance. Reforms, though still in their early stages, were starting to take effect. Some initial results had begun to emerge, but Marcus understood that this was just the beginning of a long journey. These changes could not be achieved overnight, and the resistance would not easily accept them. The police system, with all its power and influence, could not be changed in a single night. There had been positive signs, but there was also strong opposition. Conservative officers, those accustomed to maintaining power through fear and control, were not going to accept these changes easily. They had built a system based on power and silence, and being forced to confront that was a significant threat to them. Amidst this, Marcus did not stop. He continued to rally to fight for what was right. With the support of civil rights organizations and the community, he pushed for important reform policies. Independent oversight bodies were established, complaint reports about police misconduct began to be made public, and demands for transparency in police investigations became a critical part of the public justice agenda. Angela, Marcus's wife, was always his reliable companion. She was a great source of encouragement for Marcus throughout this process. She understood that these changes would not only affect their family, but millions of others who had never had the opportunity to speak up. Together, they pursued this goal not just for themselves, but for all those affected by racial discrimination and the abuse of power. Protests continued, and the number of participants grew larger. Those who had once lived in the shadows of injustice now found the light of hope. Calls for reform were made not only in New York, but spread across major cities in the U.S. And these protests were not simply about condemning the actions of a few police officers, but were a powerful call for justice and systemic change. Jason Park and Mark O'Connor. Officers involved in Marcus's arrest could no longer sit idly by. While they may not have been directly impacted, they realized that the silence and protection of the police force could no longer be easily maintained. People like Marcus were no longer willing to accept injustice and would continue to fight for the truth. Meanwhile, Marcus began to realize that he could not change everything by his personal struggle alone. He needed support from politicians, lawyers, and influential people in society. He continued to rally, encouraging the community, especially those in law enforcement, to join the reform efforts. Marcus understood that only when everyone joined in could change truly occur. In the face of strong opposition, Marcus also found reliable allies. Elizabeth Turner, a retired former prosecutor, became an important companion in this struggle. With her deep understanding of the legal system and years of experience in the field, she helped Marcus better understand how government agencies operated and how to push for change. Along with Judge Naomi Brenner, a steadfast judge in the pursuit of justice, they formed a powerful trio in this battle. Gradually, the reforms began to show results. Investigations into police misconduct were no longer overlooked in independent oversight. Agencies started to wield real power. Officers who had abused their power began facing consequences for their actions, and a part of the police system, though not perfect, began to confront its responsibilities. However, Marcus did not stop. He realized that a system cannot be changed with just minor reforms. It required a complete overhaul. His fight was not only for justice for himself, but also for those who had never had the chance to speak up. With the support of the community, Marcus continued to push for reforms. He demanded more in-depth investigations into arrests made without basis. He demanded that officers who engaged in racial profiling be held accountable. And most importantly, he called for absolute transparency in all police activities. But in Marcus's heart, he knew the road ahead would never be easy. The conservatives would still resist, and the deep-seated issues within the police system would not change easily. However, with his perseverance and determination, Marcus Hayes would never give up. He knew that only when he and others stood united would this battle come to an end, with true justice for everyone. After weeks of struggle, Marcus Hayes began to feel the sweet fruits of persistence. Reforms, though still in their early stages, were starting to take effect. Some initial results had begun to emerge, but Marcus understood that this was just the beginning of a long journey. These changes could not be achieved overnight, and the resistance would not easily accept them. The police system, with all its power and influence, could not be changed in a single night. There had been positive signs, but there was also strong opposition. Conservative officers, those accustomed to maintaining power through fear and control, were not going to accept these changes easily. They had built a system based on power and silence, and being forced to confront that was a significant threat to them. Amidst this, Marcus did not stop. He continued to rally to fight for what was right. With the support of civil rights organizations and the community, he pushed for important reform policies. Independent oversight bodies were established, police misconduct complaint reports began to be made public, and demands for transparency in police investigations became a critical part of the public justice agenda. Angela, Marcus's wife, was always his reliable companion. She was a great source of encouragement for Marcus throughout this process. She understood that these changes would not only affect their family, but millions of others who had never had the opportunity to speak up. Together, they pursued this goal not just for themselves, but for all those affected by racial discrimination and the abuse of power. Protests continued, and the number of participants grew larger. Those who had once lived in the shadows of injustice now found the light of hope. Calls for reform were made not only in New York, but spread across major cities in the U.S. These protests were not simply about condemning the actions of a few police officers, but were a powerful call for justice and systemic change. Jason Park and Mark O'Connor, the officers involved in Marcus's arrest, could no longer sit idly by. While they may not have been directly impacted, they realized that the silence and protection of the police force could no longer be easily maintained. People like Marcus were no longer willing to accept injustice and would continue to fight for the truth. Marcus Hayes' story continued to spread widely as the media began covering his case. From the first news broadcast to interviews and live discussions on television programs, his story attracted millions of people worldwide. But Marcus understood that becoming a symbol didn't mean victory. He knew that all eyes were on him, and the pressure to meet the expectations of his supporters was growing. Yet he never wavered. Deep down, Marcus understood that this struggle wasn't just for himself, but for all those who had been and were still suffering from injustice. Angela, Marcus's wife, was always by his side throughout this process. She understood that this change wasn't only affecting Marcus's life, but also their family, their community, and all those still in the shadows that Marcus had once experienced. No matter what, Angela remained his greatest source of support. She knew that although the road ahead could be long and challenging, Marcus would never be alone. Marcus's struggle didn't just stop at calling for reform in the police force. It gradually evolved into a larger movement aimed at changing how American society viewed racial discrimination. His story had created a solid foundation for important discussions about equality, the rights of minority communities, and how the legal system could or could not protect justice for everyone. From calls for justice on national forums to protests in the streets, people now saw Marcus as a leader. He became a model for standing up against oppression, for abandoning silence when witnessing wrongdoing, and most importantly, for demanding that the system face itself. This battle was not only his, but also for everyone who had no voice, those whom society had once overlooked. Marcus was no longer just a victim. He was a fighter for justice, and now he was fighting for all those who had never had the chance to speak out. He became a symbol of resilience, belief in justice, and an unrelenting desire for change. And though the road ahead was filled with challenges, Marcus knew he was not alone in this battle. He had family, friends, colleagues, and the community behind him. Marcus Hayes' story was no longer just a personal fight. It had become a battle for fairness for all. As he continued to move forward, he carried not only his own story, but a powerful message of change, freedom, and justice for all those who had been marginalized. The fight that Marcus Hayes was facing was not simply one against abuse of power. It was a fight he was waging not just for himself, but for everyone who had to live in the shadows of racial discrimination and injustice. Each day, Marcus was not just a federal prosecutor, but he had become a model of resilience and unwavering perseverance in the fight for justice. His journey was not just a solitary struggle to restore his tarnished reputation. Marcus's story reflected a harsh truth about the legal system in America, where members of minority communities were sometimes seen not as equal citizens, but merely as suspects and treated unfairly. Each step Marcus took from his arrest to his call for justice carried a powerful message. This fight was not just for one person, but for all those without a voice, all those who had been overlooked and unjustly treated. From the moment Marcus was arrested without cause, everything changed. His life was no longer just about legal cases, but it had become part of a larger movement. Protests erupted in the streets. Heated discussions appeared in newspapers, and calls for justice for everyone rang out loud and clear. Marcus's story was no longer a solitary incident, but had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle to change an entire system that had long been complicit in racial discrimination and abuse of power. Racial profiling in the police force was nothing new, but Marcus's story had taken this issue to a new level. Marcus, with his distinguished career in law, was not just an archetypal victim of discrimination. He was someone with the power and voice to challenge the system. And so his fight was not just about seeking justice for himself, but about forcing this system to recognize that the time for change had come. Throughout this struggle, Marcus faced many obstacles. The police officers abusing their power and those behind the acts of racial discrimination were not easily willing to step aside. They had become accustomed to the power in their hands, and they had often applied discrimination without oversight. But Marcus did not give up. He knew that to change something as grand as this, he had to persist and be ready to face even greater challenges. Marcus stood silently for a moment, staring at the screen. The weight of the world seemed to settle in his chest. He had come so far. But this was not just about his personal battle anymore. It had grown into something much larger, something that would define his life and the lives of so many others. He had become the face of a movement, a symbol for justice and equality, but with that came immense responsibility. As he sat down at his desk, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him here. The arrest, the media storm, the protests, and the support he'd received from all corners of the world. Yet despite the recognition and the momentum building around his cause, Marcus knew the path ahead was still fraught with obstacles. His fight was not over, and the change he sought would not come overnight. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He answered it, and the voice on the other end was familiar. It was Elizabeth Turner, the retired prosecutor who had become one of his closest allies. She wasted no time in getting to the point. "You know what this means, right?" Elizabeth's voice was calm but firm, a voice that spoke of decades of experience in the legal system. "This is the next step in the movement. They were looking to you for leadership now more than ever." Marcus nodded to himself. He had anticipated this moment. In many ways, he had prepared for it, but it didn't make the burden any lighter. "I know," Marcus replied, his voice steady. It's a lot. I've always fought for justice in the courtroom. But this is bigger. This isn't just about me. It's about every single person who's ever been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them." "Exactly," Elizabeth said. "But don't forget, you're not alone in this. You've got people who believe in you, your family, your community, the people who've been with you from the start. Together you can change things." Marcus looked out the window, the morning light casting long shadows across the city. His mind raced with thoughts of the future. The work ahead would be exhausting, filled with resistance, and possibly even more personal sacrifice. But he had come this far. He had made it this far, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced and ignored. "I won't back down," Marcus said quietly, almost to himself. "I can't." Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. The media wanted him to speak on national platforms, on television, on radio, in interviews, and on podcasts. The demands for his presence in discussions about police reform and civil rights grew by the hour. He felt like he was living under a microscope, every move scrutinized, every word analyzed. But through all of this, Marcus remained focused. His resolve was unshakable. Despite the personal cost, despite the pressure, he knew what needed to be done. This was not just about the police or the legal system. It was about breaking down the barriers of racial discrimination that plagued every corner of society. His fight had never been just for himself. It had always been for something greater. Angela, his unwavering support, continued to stand by him every step of the way. She reminded him daily that their journey wasn't just about the two of them. It was about creating a world for their children, for the next generation, where fairness and equality were more than just ideals, but a reality. Together, they faced the relentless challenges that came with Marcus's new role as a leader in the movement for justice. As protests continued to sweep the nation, as more and more people came forward to share their stories of mistreatment, Marcus became even more determined. The progress he had made, though significant, was just the beginning. The battle for justice was far from over. With each step forward, the movement grew stronger. New alliances were formed with advocates for racial justice, community organizers, and civil rights groups. The calls for systemic change grew louder, but Marcus knew that the real fight, the hardest part, was still ahead. The more support Marcus garnered, the more resistance he encountered from those who were invested in preserving the status quo. The political and social powers that had benefited from inequality and discrimination were not going to give up their grip without a fight. But Marcus had become a symbol of hope, not just for those who had suffered under the system, but for everyone who believed that change was possible. His resolve was clear. He was not just fighting for justice for himself or for his family. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been denied equality, for every person who had ever been marginalized by the systems that claimed to protect them. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Marcus Hayes never wavered. With the support of his family, his friends in the community, he continued to press for meaningful reforms. Despite the hardships, the setbacks, and the obstacles, Marcus knew that his fight was making a difference. The small victories along the way were important, but they were only the beginning. For Marcus, the battle was not about achieving a single victory. It was about creating a lasting legacy of justice for all. He understood that change took time and that no system so deeply entrenched could be transformed in an instant. But the fight for justice would continue, and he would lead it, standing tall, unwavering, and determined to change the world one step at a time. He read each line of the letter, carefully reflecting on what he would have to face. It was not a time for rest, but a responsibility. And in that moment, Marcus realized that whether he wanted to or not, he had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the desire for change. But a symbol can never remain still. It must continue to move, continue to inspire and guide people. In the greater struggle, Marcus could not forget the feeling when he first stood in the courtroom in front of thousands of people with eyes all focused on him, full of hope and anxiety. That feeling was emptiness, the feeling of facing what society had yet to change. Throughout the months, he had witnessed too much discrimination, too many injustices that no one spoke out against. No one stood up to change. The sense of victory he received from the community and those around him, though wonderful, was still not enough. It was not enough to change the system, and it was not enough to bring those who truly suffered injustice closer to justice. Marcus's story was not a perfect happy tale, but a battle full of challenges. He could not stop thinking about the pain that he and his family had endured, the sleepless nights spent contemplating the next steps. Every decision, every action he took carried heavy responsibility and consequences. The world was not easy to change, and Marcus knew that if he didn't continue fighting, those without a voice would continue to endure oppression. Justice was not something that could be easily attained, but a long, difficult journey. While many began to see Marcus Hayes as a hero, he felt that he was just getting started. The truth was, even though he had achieved some victories, society and the legal system still had too many unresolved issues. He had to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for others, for all those who had been abandoned by this system. More and more questions were being raised, struggles continued, but Marcus remained steadfast in his belief that this fight was for true justice, not just for himself, but for everyone. But there was one thing Marcus realized throughout his journey. True victory was not about immediate results, but about the lasting change it could bring for future generations. In those tense moments when facing the powerful system that was obstructing him, Marcus did not give up, because he knew that change didn't come from silence or turning a blind eye, but from standing up and speaking the truth no matter the cost. Marcus's sense of victory was not the end, but just a step in the long journey to bring justice for all. Because in this fight, Marcus knew that no one could win alone, but together we could change the world. After all the hardships and challenges, Marcus finally received recognition from the community and the legal system. He became a role model for those who had been and were still fighting for justice, a symbol of resilience and courage. These things changed Marcus's life in profound ways, but as he had realized, true victory was not the end, but only a part of the long journey. When the police reforms began to take effect, when the protests gradually stopped, and when justice seemed to have been established, Marcus still couldn't feel at peace. Even though he had achieved so much, he could not forget what he had witnessed. The pain that he and others had endured still lingered in his mind. Every time he looked into the eyes of those in the community, he felt the unhealed pain, the injustice that had not been righted. Throughout this journey, Marcus realized that even though the legal system had undergone certain reforms, true change could not come from just one decision or one battle. These changes were only the first steps. And even though he had gained recognition from the community, even though there were people standing behind him in support, Marcus understood that to sustain and expand those changes, they had to come from the people within the community, those who were directly and indirectly affected by discrimination and injustice. One morning, while Marcus was sitting in his office, he received an unexpected call from a woman named Sophia, one of the people who had participated in the protests and was part of the movement for justice. She spoke of a new painting, an image depicting the symbol of the struggle, with Marcus being the one who inspired it. This painting was to be displayed at the courthouse where he had once been handcuffed. "You've changed many things already, but justice never comes easily. It's a process, a fight that we have to engage in every day." Her words seemed to sink deep into Marcus's mind. He understood that despite achieving many victories, this fight could not end. Major changes could not simply come from a few decisions in court or reforms from the government. They required participation from the community, from the citizens, from individuals who stood up not only for themselves, but for all those without a voice. And above all, Marcus understood that this struggle would never stop. But there was one thing Marcus had never thought of: a wave of change did not stop with one individual. The movement he had started had gradually spread, creating an influence, not just in his city, but in other cities, other states, even in places he had never set foot in. People like Marcus, those who had been discriminated against by the legal system, were no longer alone. They had found each other, realizing that in a society, real change could only come when people joined together. That day when Marcus stood in front of the painting displayed in the courthouse, he felt pride but also a bit of sadness. The feeling was not one of closure but the beginning of a never-ending struggle. It was not enough to just look at the current achievements, but to continue maintaining what had been achieved, because this fight was not just his, but for everyone. And then in that quiet moment, Marcus looked at the painting with the images of him and the people who had fought alongside him. Beneath the painting was the inscription, "Justice is not a destination, but an unceasing journey." This was the message Marcus wanted to convey, a message that he not only spoke but lived with every day. It was from that moment that Marcus realized the fight would never end. He would always stand up, not just for himself, but for those without a voice. Real change came from every individual, every strong community, standing up for justice no matter the difficulty. And Marcus knew, even though it was not over, this fight would not be his alone, but the fight of all those who dared to dream of a fairer society. Now, Marcus's story was no longer just a personal victory. It had become part of the common struggle of society. The ongoing fight to create a fairer world, a world where racial discrimination no longer existed, and where everyone had the right to live and face justice equally. Marcus stood in the middle of the room, the soft light shining down from the overhead lamps, creating a tranquil atmosphere. After all he had been through, after countless moments of facing challenges, he had reached an important moment. A moment when his story was no longer just his own. His story, his struggle had become part of the common fight, a fight he believed would never end until a truly just society was achieved. Marcus looked at the large screen in front of him where thousands of people were watching him. A flame burned in his eyes, a flame of resilience and determination. He knew that his story could change the lives of others, but to achieve real change, it required the power of the community. And that power could only be realized when everyone stood together. Justice is not a moment, it is a never-ending fight. Marcus said, his voice firm and powerful. He looked at the audience, not just those watching him from afar, but also those who were feeling the same pain, the same desire for change. Don't just stand by. Stand up for what you believe in. We can change the world, but only when we stand together. Each word he spoke echoed through the space like a powerful call, urging everyone who heard it to take action. Marcus had fought throughout this journey not just for himself, but for all those who had ever been judged, overlooked, discriminated against, and abused by systems that had held power for far too long. He understood that despite the changes, without the participation of the community, none of these changes could go far. Not everyone can do what I do, but everyone can make a difference in their own lives. Believe that if we stand up, we will no longer be alone. Marcus continued. He turned back to look at the screen where eyes were focused on him. The audience, the citizens, those who longed for a fairer future. This is our fight, he said. Not just mine, but all of ours. A small victory will lead to greater victories, and when we all stand up together, we will see that justice is not something far away, but it can be achieved if we persist. The closing words of this call to action were like a powerful push to the heart of every listener. It wasn't just a simple statement. It was a declaration of change, of hope, and of the power of community. What Marcus just said was not only for him, but for all those who have ever felt abandoned, hurt, or overlooked. Marcus's story did not end here. His journey, although it had achieved many victories, was far from over. It was a long journey, an unceasing fight. And as Marcus said, true change could only come when each individual realized that they could change the world, but only when they stood up together. Marcus was not just a winner, he was a leader, someone who carried the flame to guide the next struggles. His story was not just a personal battle, but a reminder of the power of community, the strength of resilience, and the power of determination. He stood there not just as a federal prosecutor, but as a leader of the revolutionary change, a symbol for those who could not speak up for themselves, a person who had courageously faced challenges and overcome them to bring justice to everyone. Marcus's story was a reminder of persistence, of the unyielding fight, and of a future where justice was not just an abstract concept, but a reality that we all could achieve if we stood up and fought together. And now all Marcus wanted to say to you was, don't let justice just be a word. Let it be an action. Stand up, fight, and together we will change the world. If Marcus's story has touched your heart and made you think about what we can do to change this world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel today. We will continue to bring you inspiring stories, struggles for justice, and powerful changes in society. Don't miss any moment of this journey. Hit like, share this story with friends and family, because only when we stand up together can we create real change. Join our community so we can fight for justice and a better future together. Subscribe now.